Welcome to World History. Today we're going to take a little sojourn to some usually insignificant islands off the coast of China to talk about Japan. Not because Japan is an ancient or important society throughout most of history, but because Japan is going to play a really important role, especially in the first half of the 20th century. So let's talk a little bit about the Japanese and what they believe. Here are your objectives for today. Explain the Japanese values of the Heian period, analyze how the rise of the samurai changed Japanese culture, and evaluate the rise of the shogunate and how that changed Japanese government. So, let's dive into our story. One thing you have to understand is that Japan has always been sort of ruled by an emperor. The Japanese emperors always come from one family, and they're all supposedly descended from the legendary Emperor Jimmu, pictured here, who is theoretically the son of Amaterasu, the sun goddess. And so the emperors are literally divine, and even when they're not playing a major role in Japanese history, the fact that the emperors are living gods is important to understand because it explains a lot of the really weird sort of political changes that happen. The imperial family has some symbols that are also supposedly divine, and this is going to play a huge role in Japanese history. So keep in mind, emperors literally descended from gods. The traditional Japanese religion is called Shinto, and it's really complicated and hard to explain. So we'll just say that yes, there are gods, sort of like, the Greek/Roman gods, but they also believe in spirits being in a variety of different things. And so it's kind of a mix of like a polytheistic religion, but also some elements of animism. And so places that are especially sacred are marked by these torii gates, which designate, again, that this place is somewhat important in Shinto belief. Shinto rituals often involve some sort of washing/cleansing, and the emperor, especially in the later years when he had very little power, spent much of his day performing these Shinto rituals in order to make sure that the gods were appeased and things were going well. Some people still practice Shinto beliefs. You can clearly see here modern Japanese practicing some Shinto cleansing rituals. And so Shintoism still important in Japan to this day. The period when Japan really came into its own was known as the Heian period. This was a period in which the emperor mostly ruled from the capital of Kyoto. And it's where Japanese culture sort of reached its height, although Japanese culture is centered around three concepts. First, the concept of mujo, or the embracing of change. The Japanese believe that change is impossible to resist, and instead we need to embrace change as it happens and not try to hold on to what is happening now. Miyabi is the idea of proper behavior. That everyone has a specific place in life and that you need to react and act appropriately to your station. And mono no aware is the appreciation of emotion. Specifically the expression of sadness, and that sadness being tied to the impermanence of life and of existence in general. These three themes make up the sort of heart of the Japanese culture during this time period, and we see some of the most famous works of Japanese literature and Japanese art coming out of the Heian period. Politically, during the Heian period, a family called the Fujiwara family managed to take control over the emperors. They did this by marrying in their daughters into the imperial family and then generally keeping the emperors young so that the grandfather would be the real power behind the throne and the emperor would be mainly ruling as sort of a figurehead. We talk about this not because Fujiwara no Michinaga and his family are super important to history going forward, but because it establishes the idea that yes, there's an emperor here, and he's supposedly in charge, but someone else is really pulling the strings sort of behind the emperor, and the emperor is, again, mostly just a figurehead and a religious and cultural symbol. Over time, a group of landlords known as the daimyo start to rise to power in Japan. The daimyo are regional sort of warlords who control these large provinces, and they are important because Japan in general is not very fertile, and so if the land isn't being used effectively, the food supply can often be disrupted. So these daimyo are responsible for ruling these sort of domains and for controlling these local warriors called samurai, which we'll talk about in a moment. The government in Kyoto relied on these samurai to keep order in the provinces and to make sure that the food supply was not disrupted and that the Japanese could feed themselves. And so as these daimyo became more powerful than the central government, clearly some shifts in power are going to happen. The warriors controlled by these daimyo became known as samurai. The samurai would have their own sort of smaller estate, which we see here, somewhere within the domain of the daimyo, and they would pledge their service to the daimyo to go fight if the daimyo wanted them to fight. In return, the daimyo would support them and make sure they had an adequate amount of land. And the samurai were, in general, archers. Although the Japanese samurai are known for, modern day, known for their skill with swords, traditionally the Japanese samurai were horse-mounted archers who would fight duels on horseback, firing arrows at each other from a distance. So these samurai began to be the most important class in Japanese history right around the year 1200. Over time, the samurai became or were ruled by or were tied to a system of beliefs called Bushido, which lays out a series of values that the samurai are supposed to hold and to embody. The most important of these values is loyalty and proper behavior, which is emphasized most perfectly in the story of the 47 Ronin, which is a story that we'll be looking at in class. Samurai were also responsible for training with weapons to make sure that they were fierce warriors, and if their honor was challenged, one way that they could regain honor is through a form of ritual suicide known as seppuku, which again we'll talk about more in class. Eventually, all the power being held by these warrior families led the warrior families to seize control of the government. First, the Minamoto family seized control after a war called the Genpei War, which you don't need to remember, but the Minamoto family defeated the Taira family, and the head of the Minamoto clan, Minamoto no Yoritomo, had the emperor declare him shogun, or military leader of Japan. The shogun was successful at defeating a number of attempts by foreign powers to attack Japan, most famously the Mongol invasion. So while the Mongols swept over China and created their own dynasty, the Japanese were able to defeat the Mongols through a combination of incredibly fierce fighting and nature, as a number of typhoons destroyed the Mongol fleets as they attempted to invade Japan. Later, a family called the Ashikaga family seized control of the shogunate, but over time their power weakened as other Japanese warrior families, other daimyo, rose to challenge them. Finally, order completely collapsed after what is known as the Onin War, leading to a period called Sengoku. The Sengoku is a 150-year-long civil war. As various warrior families try to seize control of the government and become the shogun who actually unifies Japan, this was an incredibly brutal time period during Japanese history, and as you can see here, it's also the period in which more deadly technologies are introduced. So we're getting fighting with not just arrows and swords, but also the introduction of Western weapons, such as the musket. So that's where we're going to leave it today, with the Japanese daimyo fighting during the Sengoku, attempting to unify the entire country under one rule again. And so this brings us back to our theme. So make sure you can provide somewhat detailed answers to each of these questions. And when we come back next time, we'll talk about the men who tried to reunify Japan after the period of disunity.